Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by actor and musician David Patrick Kelly. Over the course of his long career, DP has been a part of many theater productions, TV series, and films. Some of his credits include The Warriors, 48 Hours, Commando, Dreamscape, The Crow, K-PAX, Last Man Standing, Twin Peaks, Into the Woods, The Rocky Horror Picture Show, Hair, Malcolm X, Flags of Our Fathers, Miami Vice, The Blacklist, Succession, Ray Donovan, the movie, John Wick, and many more. And on today's episode, we will focus on the 30th anniversary of the film The Crow. It is my great pleasure to welcome David Patrick Kelly.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everybody.
It's great to have you on my show. Thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule. I really appreciate it.
My great pleasure. It's a rich subject, The Crow. I was very proud of it and honored to be here with you.
DP, before we dive into The Crow, I would like to go back in time just a little bit into the late 70s when Walter Hill discovered you because The Warriors was the first film you starred in, the first major production. And how did Walter discover you back then? Because you had been doing Broadway and off-Broadway. How did everything come about?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Walter as my first film. He just received the Writers Guild Award for Lifetime Achievement. He's 84 years old now. I'm 73. And to go back, I started in Detroit. Detroit was where I was born, and I graduated from college there with a brief stop in Paris to study with Marcel Marceau at his theater school for pantomime. And I came back to Detroit and finished my degree and then came to New York in 1973. I've always been a musician actor. I think music started first. I play the mandolin for 60 years now. My mother gave me that, and I played it like a rhythm guitar in my rock band. But we were playing Detroit rock and roll, and we opened for Bob Seger, and so music was the entree for me. And I, would go down in high school to study music theory, and always that was my big break. For having that mandolin, I auditioned in my freshman year for Hair in Detroit. There was another young man named Meatloaf who was there with me. And as teenagers, we got into the cast of Hair and got our union cards. And I just could do that for a short period in 1970 because I had to keep in school to defer the draft and go to Vietnam, as my brother did and many other of my cousins and things. So I stayed in school until 1973. And but that connection in Hair and Meatloaf brought me to New York, and I came to New York, and the Hair connection got me my first off-Broadway show. It was a stage version of Sergeant Pepper, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney came to that. It was 1974 at the great Art Deco theater in New York called the Beacon Theater, where it's a huge rock venue. It's a beautiful theater, and we had this elaborate sung opera-like show of Sergeant Pepper, and I was Sergeant Pepper in that. And then it was the punk scene in New York City at CBGB's, and I put a band together, and I became part of that in 1975. It was down at CBGB's, and there was a famous festival in 1975 that included David Patrick Kelly, the Ramones, Talking Heads, Blondie, on, television, great band, and nobody had record contracts. 1975, but I was playing more and more, and but acting at the same time. I was doing Chekhov off Broadway. I was doing avant-garde plays, and I finally made it to Broadway. Came to the attention of Stephen Schwartz, and made it to Broadway, and he had me in this show called Working, which is based on a famous book by the Chicago radio personality Studs Terkel. He did these interviews with people talking about what they do all day. And so Stephen Schwartz had the idea to make this into a Broadway musical where people would do all these different characters as people talking about what they do all day. But he wanted music in it. It was a musical. And so he hired 5 different composers, one of whom was James Taylor. So because I could play the guitar so well, I got to play in his songs, Millwork and Brother Trucker, and many other ones. And I did a scary monologue in that. It was sort of a hippie character who was all talk about peace and love and loving each other, but he had a murderous underbelly. He wanted to murder everybody, really. He was really kind of a crazy. And that's who Walter Hill and Larry Gordon saw on Broadway in my Broadway debut. They saw this character. Charlie Blossom was his character's name. And I was playing guitar. And so that's where they got the idea to cast me. I had this long hippie hair, which was way unstylish at the time because it was 78. It was the time of punk rock. It was the time of John Travolta and Saturday Night Fever. And so I had this long, scary hippie hair. And Walter and Larry cast me as Luther from that show because of the intensity, the emotion. And so we'll get to this later. But when it came down to that scene that we improvised, come out to play, it was because Walter had seen me sing. And he said, "What, David, I want you to make up something here, because there's nothing in the script." And he said, sing them something. And so I didn't want to sing these lyrical type James Taylor songs. I had been playing at CBGB's and, it had this kind of energy. And so that's how it came out. It came out in that screechy way. And we just did 2 takes and I've never done it again. That's it.
Yeah, with the 3 bottles.
With the 3 bottles that I found, they used to sell these little bottles of beer. And originally I held up 3 pigeons, because they used to, unfortunately, out there in Coney Island, they would poison the pigeons because they were such a nuisance for the businesses. But Walter said that won't work, and we went to bottles. I found these bottles instead, and that's the way he shot it and kept it in. Right. And so that was the beginning, and then I was doing films after that. But I've always come back to the stage. I'm on stage right now doing Ibsen, Enemy of the People on Broadway right now.
Great. Thank you. And you have done a couple of films with Walter. Warriors obviously was the first, and it did 48 Hours just 3 years later. And your character was also named Luther. And then you did Last Man Standing with him also.
Yeah, and they've always had a kind of literary basis. The Warriors, of course, was the Greek Xenophon's Anabasis. And in 48 Hours, it was prison literature, this guy named Malcolm Braley and great jazz saxophone Art Pepper, Straight Life, talking about his life in prison. And so we used that, Remar and I used that as the basis for our characters in 48 Hours. And Luther, I think, was just an homage to the Warriors. It wasn't really connected in any real way in the script. Yeah, and Last Man Standing, the literary connection was the novelist talking about Chicago gang. Studs Lonigan was the name of a book all about Chicago Irish gangsters, and that became the basis for Last Man Standing by Charles T. Farrell. And it was quite a time. That was the early 20th century when there was the melting pot was still having trouble melting. And so it must have been a very real thing to have gangsters on the border overseeing the illegal booze coming into the United States, and so the story is very rich in that one as well.
TP, how would you describe the legacy of films such as The Warriors and also 48 Hours? I mean, I also a couple of years back, I interviewed Billy Weber, who also edited 48 Hours and also The Warriors. And he also mentioned that the whole energy back then in the late 70s was really something, and that Warriors created something that brought out the worst in the gangs and the gang environment and the whole thing that was present in the 70s. What do you remember of those days?
Well, I would take a positive spin on it because the review that I read, along with Pauline Kael, the great critic for the New Yorker, she came out with this really unexpected rave, that they used for the advertising, and that was a thrill because I had read and studied her books when I was in high school, just to see what films are worthwhile and what to see and things like that. And so another review was in the Catholic magazine called America. It's a Jesuit magazine. And there was a review in that of the Warriors that said, well, this film is stirring up people because it represents people who have not seen themselves on screen before. Even though it was, rather Hollywoodish in the casting and things like that, nonetheless, it represented people and their feelings in a way that hadn't been done before. Walter has said this, and I'm echoing him, that it wasn't judgmental about gangs. It showed that this was something you could belong to and defend yourself, something where you feel like you had somebody had your back. And so that's my take on it. I think, although it did stir up things for people that came to the theater, I think it also represented something positive for them, something where they saw themselves. That's a big thing in our culture now, where people say, I see you, I see you, I appreciate you. So now you can see that that's what they were saying back then. And it was at the beginning of the hip hop culture. So the music for hip hop was using it as an inspiration, to say, yes, we matter, we're something, you know. And I think that's an important part of it. That's its legacy for me, is that it showed people uh, who hadn't been seen before. I just had a conversation with Lin Manuel Miranda, who is the author, of course, of Hamilton, and he grew up in the Heights in Upper Manhattan, and he saw it. He told me unbelievably when he was 4 years old, he saw the Warriors, and for him, it was just foundational. It really meant the world to him. So apparently, he's working on something right now based on it. And I don't know what it will be, but if anybody could do it, he could. And so I think that's its positive legacy, and I'm very proud of that. And yeah, I I think it goes on. And to continue with your question about those Walter Hill films, he, I think, is secretly an architect. He talks in architectural terms. And so I remember seeing his first films, Hard Times and The Driver, and how stylized they were. And I think that's a contribution to, the legacy. That's what makes them last, is because they are so particularly stylized. It's like a painter, you recognize their style, you know, and that I think makes them last. And it's not that they're particularly well received at the time, but they tend to last because of this style that he has. I was pleased to see when he accepted his recent award, Walter Hill, that he received a letter from John Woo and from Kurosawa, Akira Kurosawa, about Last Man Standing. And I was very proud of that, that they appreciated that film, those two masters.
Yeah, and I also know that Walter Hill refers to his films as westerns. So it's either a classic, a traditional western such as Last Man Standing, or an urban western, let's say, such as 48 Hours, and even the Warriors could be described as a western. And also cinematography plays a big part in his films.
Huge. Yeah.
Rick Wade, 48 Hours, or Andrew Laszlo on the Warriors, for instance. So it's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's quite a character, Andrew. He is a Holocaust survivor, and he came as a teenager, young teenager, to New York, and he worked his way up. And I was thrilled to learn as a music freak that he filmed the famous Beatles concert at Shea Stadium, the baseball stadium. That was him. He was a cameraman for the Ed Sullivan Show, and they asked him to. He was on the crew, and he filmed the Beatles at Shea Stadium. And so his whole inventiveness of wetting down the streets, and you know that was part of the contribution to this style again. That is often imitated. Now, and yeah, you're right. Those camera folks are fantastic.
DP, before we dive right into The Crow, allow me one last question. Many people seem to gravitate towards, 70s filmmaking, the 80s, the 90s, and of course other decades as well. But what do you think was so special about making movies in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s?
I think there was just, there were more and more people coming out of film schools rather than the school of hard knocks, early directors. These are people coming out of institutes and film schools. Coppola, Larry Gordon was actually part of the school of hard knocks group. He did, Roger Corman type movies, and then be hooked up with Walter, who went to Michigan State, and I think UC in California. With Alan Graff, his longtime stuntman, who's in Last Man Standing, who was on the football team at UCS, and so I think this idea of people becoming more and more knowledgeable and appreciative of it, I think it had to do with the art cinemas, the places dedicated. That's where I went in the 70s. I had James Agee. Do you know this critic, James Agee? He wrote, what's the great movie with Robert Mitchum, where he has the tattoos, Love and Hate, on his, Charles Lawton directed it, Night of the Hunter. These type of movies, James Agee wrote that. He was a critic, and he wrote this amazing book of film criticism. He wrote columns and film critics. And I've always appreciated critics and journalists about film. They get a bad rap because they sometimes do bad reviews. They sometimes take things to task. But nonetheless, for the Warriors, I read some critiques of Saturday Night Fever, and learned about Hubert Selby, who wrote Last Exit to Brooklyn. Because some critic in there had mentioned this is, he didn't like Saturday Night Fever, but he said it should be like this: Last Exit to Brooklyn. And so I used that for the Warriors. That was part of the literature I was using for the Warriors as well. And so I think there was just an energy. There was an upgrade in people's love and appreciation. All these art houses in New York. I'd go to the New Yorker art house. It had 2 cinemas there, so I'd see, Louis Malle's Phantom India. If you ever seen that 9-part documentary on India that he did, and then I'd go and see, kung fu movies, that were showing, and the Museum of Modern Art, and so there was this love and appreciation. My second film after The Warriors was produced by Coppola out in Hollywood. It was the first time I'd ever been in Hollywood, and it was Wim Wenders, and Wim had gone to an amazing institute in Germany. I can't remember the name of it, but he was just an encyclopedia of knowledge about American and world cinema. On that film, we had Sam Fuller was acting in it. We had several of John Ford's character actors, Royal Dano, and, on and on. He had 2 film noir camera people, Phil Lathrop and Joe Byrock, these old cinematographers who were both on that, And we worked first in San Francisco. Then we worked at Coppola's studio in Hollywood, and it was just an education for me. It was stunning. I was an older actor. I was 29 or 30 at that time, but still, to go to school with these guys, and then he had old character actors. He had Sylvia Sidney and Elisha Cook Jr. were in that. And so Hammett was an amazing experience for me, and that was 1979 and 80. And so I'd only done two films by then. 78 was when we shot The Warriors, and that whole energy. Everybody was revering the ground up energy of Scorsese, his early films, Mean Streets, and the kind of gutsiness of George Lucas and Coppola and the guys that come out of UCLA and managed to convince these producers, old school producers, to take a chance on their projects. THX 1138 and The Godfather. But before that, Coppola was writing Patton, I think, and writing all these amazing scripts. And Scorsese was working for Roger Corman, and De Niro was too, and so it was that whole energy. Roger Corman, those type of people that were invaluable at creating this. They were living film schools. They said, I'm going to give you only this much. You got to shoot fast. You got to do this. And so that was the energy. And people said, we can do this, And so it was thrilling. It was a thrilling time. I remember I was on the staff at this famous rock club in New York City called Max's Kansas City. I played there eventually. This was just before CBGB's and the punk thing, 73, 74. And, it was the place. It was the nexus of film, television. Everybody was doing everything there. Maybe it came from Andy Warhol, who hung out at this club, Max's Kansas City. Downstairs was the restaurant. Upstairs was the music. And, everybody played there. Tiny, Michael, tiny little room. And you had Springsteen with his first album. An opening for Bruce Springsteen were the Wailers from Jamaica with their first album. You had Billy Joel with one album. You had on and on, Hall & Oates. You had Charles Mingus Quartet. You had, so that was my graduate school. That's where I directed a play there, and I played music there. And that was the energy that was around. You're acting about the 70s, and that was it. Debbie Harry was a waitress there downstairs. Patti Smith performed there when it was just her and Lenny Kaye on guitar. So everybody was doing everything. And there were actors and directors, and everybody else was downstairs in that restaurant, So if somebody did a true history of Max's Kansas City, you'd have the beginnings of so much stuff, so much stuff. It was the beginning of punk rock. It was the beginning of all these different films, that people were making, and art, painters, Mickey Ruskin, who ran Max's Kansas City, loved painters and artists. He said, the artists are the only people you can talk to, only ones who'll have a good conversation. So he would support them. And they would often be broke. And so they'd leave a giant sculpture in the middle of the restaurant. That would be what they'd pay their bar tab with, So people like Mickey Ruskin, I don't talk about this enough. There are people that I call the tiny kings, these club owners in the 70s. Hilly Christo from CBGB's, Paul Colby from the other end, Louis Friedman from a place called Reno Sweeney's character taken from Brecht, and Mickey Ruskin are some of them. There were more and more, but they had these clubs which were like salons, which are the equal or surpass the ones in Paris in the 20s. These were people where people met, where they convened, where they had ideas and where they did them. I did, so many other people did as well. And that is what you can see in the cinema of the 70s, that energy,
Yeah, and so many people really started out in the 70s and their career caught fire, Brian De Palma, Steven Spielberg, and then many other great artists. So it was a great time. I mean, obviously I didn't live through the 70s, but of course I know about the artists and the movies, obviously.
Yeah, I think it was, post Watergate, post Vietnam era, and people were just really investing in art. And I was going to say, one night I was working upstairs at Max's, and here comes young Robert De Niro, uh, and I bought him a beer after he just finished Bang the Drum Slowly, which was only like his second or third film, I believe, something like that. Before Taxi Driver, before anything, he'd done Mean Streets. Everybody'd seen Mean Streets, but um, so and all the actors came to that place, and
Wow.
these club owners really were astonishing. They had a vision. Art DeLugoff, I didn't mention him, where Sam Shepard was a busboy, at that place. He had the Village Gate, which was another place that all jazz and shows and different things. So these guys are unheralded, but they're the kind of, they're really the kind of impresarios of the day that really fostered a creative environment. So it was a great question, and I think that has a lot to do with it. These kind of salons, I'm a student of that. I love the idea of the Berlin collectives, and St. Petersburg when Pushkin and Gogol were there, and the 50s when the Beats were getting together here in the U.S., and those idea of a kind of collective consciousness where people are, being creative and happening, and that was one in the 70s, big one.
Great. Thank you very much for commenting on that. And okay, let's dive right into The Crow and the 30th anniversary of this 90s classic film. What was the main reason for you to do The Crow? Was it the comic book? Was it James O'Barr's story? Was it the opportunity to work with Alex Proyas or the producing team of Jeff Mose at Pressman? What sold you on the idea?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it was O'Barr's book and the story and the emotion that came off of that. It was very touching to me. You know, um, you know, everybody knows it was based on a real circumstance in his own life. Uh, so it was that evoked something in me. I said, well, I'd like to be a part of telling this story because it really creates an emotion. And that's the goal. You want to create an emotion in your audience to say, how do you deal with loss, tragic loss like this? How do you deal with it? And the second big part of it was Detroit. Now, we talked about those people that I liked so much in New York. And writers always say you have to write what and I'd never done anything based in Detroit. And I wanted to do something based in Detroit, even though it was a cartoon representation of it. And we'll talk further about Alex McDowell's amazing evocation of this cartoon version of Detroit. And but those were the two reasons: the emotion in O'Barr's original story, and O'Barr seemed to me, reading the story and knowing him more, was such an interesting character. I don't know if you know the literature of Cornell Woolrich or the fellow who wrote the original story that Truffaut based Shoot the Piano Player on. Shoot the Piano Player was based on these dark novels, these gritty pulp fiction novels. And Cornell Woolrich wrote them as well. And that's what O'Barr seemed to be for me. He was one of these characters. He was a veteran from the Marines. He was living in the scary quarters of downtown Detroit, this haunted area, and he was listening to Joy Division and, all these dark themed goth, you know, types of music. And he was quite a fascinating character in his own right. So that's what fascinated me a lot. His own character. It evoked this haunted kind of film noir character in its own. And then it had this rock and roll on top of it. And he was so well versed and used it as literature. He used the lyrics and the tone and the everything else as literature, and I thought that hadn't been seen really. I hadn't really seen anything like that, and I was so honored when Robert Smith, talking about The Crow, said that he liked it better than Batman, you know, uh, and he wrote that beautiful commission song, uh, which is one of my two favorites, "Burn" for The Crow, and so those are the reasons. Detroit, James O'Barr.
Great. And thank you. And the story is really fascinating. And as James O'Barr also once put it, the basic idea of the film is that love transcends death. And also, it's about coping with loss, as you previously mentioned. And the story is pretty grim. It's a violent tale, interesting characters, and the comic was not a mainstream comic book, obviously. And to me, the film is so fascinating also because it was released during a time when comic book adaptations were not a dime a dozen. So it had a unique feel to it, and obviously the whole team did a great job. And this was Alex Proyas' second film. So how did he discuss with you the character of T-Bird and the whole gang you were a part of?
Alex was in full command of this. I'd seen his other work, and I don't know if he's totally responsible for it, but he commanded it. So putting this team together was a stunning thing, his with the Alex McDowell's beautiful sets that we discussed before, and Graham Revel's thing with the music. I think he maybe worked with some of these guys before. Um, and I'm so thrilled, finding out, that Alex McDowell was part of the British punk beginnings. He printed the shirts for the Vivian Westwood shop, that started the Sex Pistols and all these things. It's a really fascinating group, and Graham Revel was part of this industrial music, from New Zealand. Dariusz Wolski, that cinematographer. So I don't know. I asked him about things like that. I think he kind of left it up to us in a way, but I did notice for you, how much literature was involved in this movie. I will often ask, like, Alex, what his influences were, and he mentioned Andrei Tarkovsky, and his great book Sculpting in Time, and if you see his movies, Stalker and Andrei Rublev and Solaris and all these great Tarkovsky films, you can see the style and the control and the emotion really that goes into these crafting these movies, and so hearing that really lit my fire in a big way, that he would be, trying for something on that scale, and obviously, I learned more and more about these folks that I was working with later, because I didn't know too much about them at the time, and they hadn't done all that much up to that time. I think Alex McDowell was just coming out of commercials and music videos, as was Alex Proyas, and Dariusz Wolski hadn't done too much, but since then he's gone on and on and on, and Graham Revel, of course, and so, back to Alex, he just appreciated my insights about Detroit, and having grown up there and gone to school, graduated from the University of Detroit, and lived in the same areas that James O'Barr had lived in, that were being evoked, and the idea of the influence on children, the child character in the movie, is so touching, and David Show, the film script writer who wrote these incredible lines about mother is the name for God and children's eyes, is so great. And these were things that were so contributory, and so Alex's idea of this Tarkovsky landscape, and some of the other literature that was involved. I asked Darius Volsky what he was reading. He was reading D.H. Lawrence, The Fantasia of the Unconscious, because he didn't want a story. He wanted ideas about life. That's what Darius was reading. And I was reading Moby Dick, Herman Melville's dark, horrible search for vengeance from Captain Ahab on the whale, and there was so much stuff because it was indicated in Obar's original thing. And uh, just to jump ahead to talk about Brandon, when I had the great gift to speak with Brandon and talk about what we were going to try to do, mostly we maintained our discipline, stayed separate, so I could be the bad guy and he could be the hero. And but we did discuss trying to get more of the original comic books language back in. So you can hear that in two places that I tried to do it was when T-Bird talks to Top Dollar and he says, some of my people got themselves perished. I use this old fashioned language. And I was influenced by Anthony Burgess' Clockwork Orange. I read Clockwork Orange because of its effect on people. People are so influenced by the movie of Clockwork Orange, they don't realize reading the original small novel by Anthony Burgess that he comes to the end of the first part where all the ultra violence happens, and he's about to be treated with the Ludovico treatment, I think they called that, where they propped his eyes open, and he says, all this ultra violence, all these horrible crimes had happened, and me only 15 years old. That's the final words of the first half of that book. And I said, wow, okay, so I see it now. And in Detroit, previous to this, there were gangs of 12-year-old kids that the older gang members got to deliver drugs and do crimes because they couldn't go to jail. That was the idea, in Detroit, in the original Detroit. And the idea of Devil's Night I was so familiar with. So these are the kinds of things that Alex was very interested in hearing about, and knowing, relatively firsthand knowledge of. I mean, we used to sit in Detroit on New Year's and hear people shoot off their guns. That was New Year's in Detroit, New Year's celebration. So his idea, to try to evoke this was had a multi-level approach, all these great people he got involved, and his idea of telling this story, which I think was personal for him too, and this idea of a love story that ends tragically. That was what he brought to it. That was so evocative.
What do you think is the allure of playing a villain, a bad guy, so to speak?
I'm a Stanislavski actor, uh, sort of semi method. I like to stay in character, but not if it troubles the working. You can't make it all about you. And one of the big parts that people overlook about Stanislavski, he interpreted the script. He wanted to know what the story was about. There's a legal term, sine qua non, which is the piece of evidence without which it would not exist. The case wouldn't exist, the crime wouldn't exist, the story wouldn't exist. So he uses that, Stanislavski, in analyzing scripts. I always say, what is this story about? And how can my character support what that is? So this was a story of an angel of vengeance, if you will, getting back. So you have to make the crime horrible and you have to make the justice sweet, if you will, or at least that you feel that justice. It's not really playing a bad guy, it's being a part of a great story. And what can you do as an actor, an interpretive artist, to make that story pop, to make that story vital, to make it really have an effect and be useful as art. And I've always compared it to painting, where you have a giant canvas masterpiece and there's a little dog in the corner or a man standing looking at the sea. And the rest of the canvas is probably more important, interpreted. But if it wasn't for that one person, that one man, that one little dog, the balance would not be right. So that's the value. You don't think of it as a bad guy, you just think of it as, what can I do to help this story? How do I have to, the character has these traits, he's doing this job, he's doing this, and you make the story vital by what you understand the whole story is, the tent pole of the whole story. And if you can help to hold that tent pole up by doing your illustration, by being that man in the corner, by being that little dog, then it helps the whole thing and people remember it. They know because it is important to the whole story.
Which scene do you think stood out the most for you personally? Either because it may have a certain meaning to it, or because of the actor in a specific scene?
Well, there's three actually. I hope you forgive me. It's not one specific one. I really liked where you see the crime in the beginning, where I light the cigar and talk about, it's a line that I added to the script about the lake in Michigan that had been set on fire because it was so polluted, and then we go in and commit the horrible crime. And that one, and then the one where Brandon captures me, and then the one where T-Bird meets his demise. And this was, we had come back after the tragedy of losing Brandon, because we wanted to finish the film for Brandon, for his legacy. And they only had one close-up. Alex told us, he convened us all. He said, they have one amazing close-up of Brandon. And so David Show went and wrote a beautiful monologue for me as Brandon is tying me in. And we had that close-up of Brandon where he's not speaking. He's just the angel of vengeance. And then Chad Stelsky. Do you know that name?
Yeah, absolutely. He used to be a stunt coordinator and he's a director now of John Wick, for instance. Yeah.
Right. He was Brandon's body double. And he did the double C, everything else aside from that close up of Brandon is Chad Stelsky strapping me in and putting the hand grenade on my lap. And so, and I improvised, added a few things in David's beautiful fugue, as he calls it, T-Bird's demise, where he's talking about, you're not real, we killed you. And I added lines from Richard Hell. Do you know this punk rocker? He had a song called Time that was covered by a brilliant short-lived band called the Minutemen. And in his song Time, he said, I want to write a song that's really, really, really real, And because it had Richard Hell's name and because I like that line, Smokey Robinson from Detroit had also written a song that had this kind of repetition in it, really, really real, And so that I added in when Eric Draven is doing away with T-Bird, So, and I wanted to show, I was influenced very much by, it's kind of in a different way. James Cagney had done a movie, I think it's Angels with Dirty Faces. The priest, Pat O'Brien, had convinced James Cagney, the gangster, to pretend to be a coward so that the kids, when he was going to death row, when he was going to his final end, he asked, the priest said, you got to pretend to be a coward so the kids aren't influenced by you. And so he did. He pretended to break down and cry when he was going. And the kids said, wow, he wasn't as tough as I thought he was. He was just a punk gangster, And I wanted my character in this to be sincere. But in the larger movie that I knew kids were going to be seeing, and that influenced by that Clockwork Orange testimony that this kid was 15 years old and he did all these crimes. I wanted to show that there's something greater. If you believe in God, if you believe in the hereafter, I wanted to show that it's not all about power on this earth. It's about something greater. And that's what we tried to prove. And I think we did a good job of in that scene, you know. So that's why it's my favorite.
Thank you. And the film has many standout moments, and as you mentioned, the arcade scene, for instance, at the beginning, and the quote of Lake Erie, and of course T-Bird's demise, which I think is a phenomenal scene in which you also said or quoted, "Abashed the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is." Because at this moment, he needs to come to terms with the fact that Brandon's character came back, and you keep on saying, this is the really real world, and there ain't no coming back. There ain't no coming back, and that's one of the key scenes of the film, and how the car then took off and how it was filmed. I think it had a phenomenal impact also on me as a viewer.
Well, thank you. I have to tell you an amusing story based on that. Now, for years now, James Remar and the cast of The Warriors have been trying to get me to go to autograph shows, and I've never done them because you can make some nice cash and it's fun. It actually, now I did two, and Remar convinced me to go. You know, he wasn't there, the Warriors were there. I did it on my own. But a guy showed up in North Carolina where I was for this autograph show. And it's fun. It's like being at an art gallery. Like you're an artist at a gallery and people come and they, you know, I thought it was going to be horrifying, you know, but it was actually quite fun. And a guy brought the dashboard of that car. He found in a junkyard the dashboard of T-Bird's T-Bird and brought it to the show. It was a mess, you know, it was just this. And he, you know, he said, "Here, do you want the gas cap?" And he gave me the gas cap from the car. And I said, "No, man, thank you. You can keep that." But he wanted me to autograph the thing, and he wanted photos with the two of us in this dashboard of the original car that he had somehow found in North Carolina where we filmed The Crow. And I was astonished. It gave me chills. You know, it was really, really something. So
Great.
that scene had an impact on him too, apparently.
The flashback sequences also were enormously powerful, you know, with Brandon and his fiance, and when
Right.
you were obviously ordered by Top Dollar and Michael Wincott's character to clean out the apartment, and then that's the scene obviously when Brandon Lee's character in the film is thrown out of the window. Those flashbacks had a tremendous impact because Dariusz Wolski also shot them in a certain light, so you could tell the difference between flashback and the present time, because cinematographically speaking they are different.
After the tragedy of losing Brandon, and it was a horrible thing, such a wonderful talent and such a wonderful, spirit, you know, and the brief time that I had with him is so sad. You know, the first time I met Brandon, I said to him, "Your father was a big influence on me," and and I was training for my first black belt at the old age of 40 something at that time. And Brandon said, "I'll train with you when we're done with the filming," you know. And it was so touching to me, you know. And so after his passing, it was a horrible thing, you know. We waited all night and found out the tragic news. I think 12 or 14 hours later at the hospital, we found out that Brandon had passed. And I went to a church. We were driving home early in the morning, and I went to a church, and it was never open when I tried to go before, and it was open for some reason this morning. And I went in, it was just me, and the light was coming through stained glass window. And I felt this kind of awful grace. Awful grace is the only way I can describe it, you know. And the feeling of the unconsoling consolation of God, you know. And And it was a terrible moment. We all left. We left from Wilmington, North Carolina, and we didn't know how it was going to be, what was going to happen with the rest of the movie. I went to England to visit my family who were living there at the time, my brother. I went to see Hamlet out at Stratford-on-Avon, and I went another revenge tale, and I went to Shakespeare's home, which was right nearby, and there was a bookstore, and I found this illustrated copy of Paradise Lost. William Blake did the illustrations, and it had been mentioned. I believe it's mentioned in the original comic book, Paradise Lost. I'm not sure, but I may be putting that on it, but I think it was mentioned. So I found it, and I took it back. It was a beautiful edition. And then Alex convened us all and said, what can we do? Do you want to finish this or not? And we said, yeah, we want to do it for Brandon. And I had this book, and we figured out how to do those scenes again, the ones you were just speaking about, that Darius filmed so beautifully. And I had this book as if this was a book in their artistic loft that we had invaded and desecrated. And, I read that during the horrible crime as a vicious irony of someone who doesn't understand it. And they're reading it and they're showing it during the crime. And then in the flashback, when T-Bird meets his demise, not the flashback, the end of the story, he finally realizes what that means, And it's a complex line from Milton, abashed, the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is. Because where it is in Paradise Lost is the devil has rebelled against God, right? He's the ultimate bad guy, right? He sees Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, who has remained faithful in all his radiance. And that's what he says. He looks at Gabriel and says, abashed, the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is, how full of awe goodness is. That's what that means, awful. And that's the idea of that scene and that flashback, So it came from me finding this book, bringing it to Alex. This can be one of the reasons, one of the ways in which we can finish this legacy for Brandon, and it really seemed like a godsend for me. This amazing bookstore right near Shakespeare's home in Stratford-on-Avon, and I was only there for a week or two maybe, and then came back and we finished the film. I hope that it's an important legacy for Brandon and his family.
I'm glad you finished the film. It has a tremendous legacy, a huge shelf life. Many people love it, and I'm looking forward to the new 4K UHD. It's a new Blu-ray, a 4K remastered Blu-ray, which will be available shortly, and I'm looking forward to that. Improved picture quality and hopefully improved picture, video, and audio quality. Yeah.
Oh, I've seen Darius talking about it. He was helpful in trying to put that out. I think he worked on it, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I think he worked on the transfer and signed off on it. I would expect that, yeah. And I'm also glad that Graham Revell's score was re-released in a more complete form. And obviously the music plays a big part of the film. I love the songs, The Cure and also Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor. But Graham's score really also captured the spirit of the film and the essence of it, as of course that's what film music is supposed to do. And Graham did a fantastic job, I think. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. And and I'm pretty sure my research told me that he commissioned both Burn from Robert Smith, and It Can't Rain All the Time. And those are the top for me. I like other songs and the score as well, but they kind of bookend the whole thing. Burn and Jane Siberry's "It Can't Rain All the Time." I even see kids on the subway in New York here with T-shirts that say "It Can't Rain All the Time" on it, and beautiful song, beautiful sentiments that is that is really still so vibrant, so resonant. But also, I didn't say that I really felt that when it came out after the tragedy, then after that was Kurt Cobain's tragedy. I really felt like The Crow was kind of a rebel without a cause for the grunge generation. You know, the score was so popular. It had so many of the grunge folks involved in it that it really represented something. And I don't know the dates how that hooks up with Kurt Cobain's tragic end as well. But I think it was somehow connected for me. I think that's what made it so popular. I know people talk about it.
As an actor, David, how do you perceive an on-set atmosphere and use that to maybe influence your performance?
Well, it's all so technical. I think you have to create that atmosphere in your own mind a lot, because often you're just looking at crew or technical stuff and you're not, you know, the one time that I really kind of tripped out about an atmosphere was my second film with Wim Wenders. You know, I went to San Francisco for the first time. We were doing a film that was based on Dashiell Hammett, and we had these intricate costumes, and I was sitting on the actual streets that Dashiell Hammett walked down in San Francisco, and I was playing this character, and I actually kind of, these old cars were going by, and it was like, it was a ghostly presence. And, I really felt how evocative that was, and so it was quite easy to get into that. Many actors and myself included, use music. This was the 1920s, this time period for Hammett. So I was playing the ukulele at the time. I was playing early jazz songs, and Cole Porter and things like that. And we had Sylvia Sidney, who was early Hitchcock actress, glorious, and she was in her 80s at this time, I think, something like that. And so I was singing her a Cole Porter song on our drive back to the hotel one night on the ukulele, and she knew Cole Porter. So I was singing this song, I'm in love again, and I can't rise above it. And she said at the end, she said, that was close. That was pretty close. But she wasn't, too much with her compliments, but it was great. And it was great to be a part of that environment, and use what you can to make the mood, to make it happen.
May I get your quick thoughts on David Lynch and Twin Peaks? Because you were obviously also a part of that show, which I think has some very fascinating elements in there. And obviously David Lynch is one of the most, let's say, unconventional directors out there. So what was it like for you to work with him and on that particular project, if I may ask?
It's an honor. He's fantastic, and he comes from this art school background, so he's very much in control. The original season and a half that we did were different directors, some very fine,
yeah, and
then just one or two times I worked with David during that. We'd done Wild at Heart, and then some of the episodes of the original Twin Peaks. But then David did every episode of The Return.
Correct. Yeah.
And I thought that was so great. It was really great, and I was thrilled to be a part of it, and to be a part of that return. People had mentioned that they were going to do this 25 years later. And I said, well, he'll just have young people in that, because but he had, he's always his whole career he's had older actors be a part of it. As I mentioned, you know, uh, he's like Wim Wenders. He's encyclopedic about his knowledge. And I just saw this film, Experiment in Terror. I don't know if you saw that ever. It's a great film noir, which was quite influential on David for Twin Peaks. And it's terrific, and it has many of the same elements as in Twin Peaks, and I could see Mark Frost and David being influenced by that. Um, and those characters were fascinating. I talk about David because his work to me um, sort of defines this split in American consciousness. There was the '50s. You can see this really clearly in Blue Velvet, but you can also see it in Wild at Heart, and very much so in Twin Peaks. From the sort of sedate '50s, the kind of, it wasn't really this way, but it seemed very sedate and controlled. And then the '60s explodes, after the Kennedy assassination, and everything goes mad, And it's very clear to me in his work that that's part of the sensibility that's going on there. And Wild at Heart was very much about that, and they mentioned to me, Mark and David, that they had been working on a story about Marilyn Monroe. This other director recently did it with Ana de Armas, a story about Marilyn Monroe. But Twin Peaks was originally based on Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedy brothers and that kind of conspiracy theories. I'm an old school Kennedy Democrat. I saw John Kennedy speak, and I saw Robert Kennedy speak in Detroit when I based Jerry Horn on the Kennedy brothers. It was the National Enquirer version of the Kennedy brothers. If you read about them and believed, as I don't, every bad thing that ever happened with them, that's what I based the Horn brothers on, and Jerry Horn, and specifically, and that came from them. That came from David and Mark Frost, who had been working on that, and they mentioned that. And at one point in this season 2, Ben Horn was going to run for the Senate. So, if it had gone on, you would see how this might have developed into something quite different than it did, But it was thrilling to be a part of it. Great, great honor.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap up for today?
Delightful. Hi to all the great folks in Germany, and hope to come and visit soon.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking so much time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that. And I had a great time talking to you, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Thanks, Michael.